Hello again, everyone. This is Sohaila Bana. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. I'm very pleased that we have our police chief, Bisa French, with us today. Thank you very much, Chief French. It's very kind of you. I know how busy you are. It's very nice of you to have an hour with us this evening to talk about the status of your department, how things are going, and just share with us. Please, you have the floor.
Sure, thank you. So thank you for inviting me tonight. It's always nice to talk to the community about where we are as a department, and specifically tonight I'll be talking about our staffing because that's what Councilmember Bonner asked me to speak about tonight. So I think you all will be happy to know
I'm sorry,
that.
I'm a council member, but here it's just a community gathering. So I'm just Sohaila tonight.
Okay, well, so
Please
Hayla asked me
continue.
to talk about
Thank you.
where we are with our current staffing. And so I'm sure you all know that the police department has been challenged with our staffing for several years now. Our staffing numbers first began to decline several years ago as we had to cut positions due to city budget issues. Each year, we lost several positions. So I could go back like 2015, we were authorized at that point to have 183 sworn officers. Today, we are currently authorized to have 145 officers. So we lost positions over the years. The most significant losses came in 2020 and 2021. In those particular years, we went from 157 officers authorized in 2020 to where we are now with 145 officers that are authorized. Of that number, unfortunately, we only have 120 field positions. So while we're authorized 144 sworn police officers, and that's from myself all the way down to the officers that are still in the academy training, we only have 120 total at this point. On top of that, at any given moment over the last 5 years, we've consistently have about 10 officers that are off on injury leave at any given time. So that's the average number. I think right now we probably have 12, but the average number is 10. So if you take 120 that we currently have employed and you take that 10 away, then we have 110 officers to deploy across the city, again, including myself. The good news is, what I wanted to start off with, is that we are moving in a positive direction. So over the last 5+ years, our separations from the department, meaning people that have left, officers that have left to go for many different reasons, either retirements, they've gone to work at other departments, they've gone away from law enforcement altogether. Those numbers of separations have really outpaced our ability to hire new police officers. So the numbers have just been completely off. This year, it has finally changed where we've hired more police officers this year than we've lost so far. So this year, that's the good news. This year, we've hired 17 police officers, and I believe we've lost maybe 5. So that's a good thing. Our numbers are going the opposite direction. With that being said, obviously we can't do as much as we did with 185 officers as we can't do with 110 officers what we did with 185 officers. So every unit within our department has been impacted. And in fact, we've lost most of our ancillary units. When I say ancillary units, we have a patrol division, we have an administrative division, and we have an investigations division. So patrol officers are the ones that you come in contact most often. Those are the officers that respond to calls for service, and they do proactive work across the community. Then we have our investigations, which are the detectives that investigate additional follow-up from those cases that are made through the patrol officer. So a patrol officer takes a report, it's a felony report, or they arrest somebody, those cases go to the detectives, and the detectives follow up on those cases, a lot of times working with the district attorney's office for prosecution or working with victims for additional services. They do all the pretty much the follow-up work. And then we have several officers in our administrative bureau, and they take care of the training and the hiring, recruiting, those types of things. So those are our 3 different divisions. Those are where we have all of the officers. So when I say the ancillary units, we used to have additional officers, whether they were housed in investigations or patrol. Those were officers that supplemented the jobs that were being done in those units. So for example, many of you are familiar with traffic units. So traffic units are separate from patrol, as they don't necessarily go to calls for service, but they handle all the traffic issues and they watch out for traffic violations. This year, unfortunately, due to our staffing, we were no longer able to deploy a standalone traffic unit. So those officers that used to be within our traffic unit had to go back to patrol to actually cover a beat and respond to calls for service. Now, they still do try to do traffic enforcement when they are not on a call for service, but their primary duty is to respond to the calls for service that come into our communication center. Additionally, we used to have officers on a community violence reduction team. So that was a group of officers that specifically addressed violence within the community. They did a lot of proactive work. So if we knew that there was some kind of issue going on between different communities or shootings that were happening, they would direct their efforts into those particular communities, do a lot of the background work to see who might be involved, and spend a lot of time on violence reduction. We had a regulatory unit that used to regulate marijuana grows. They responded to the illegal marijuana grows. They did a lot of ABC operations within store units to make sure stores are complying with the ABC laws and not selling to minors and stuff like that. They did compliance checks at massage parlors to make sure there was no human trafficking, those types of things. We no longer have that unit. We had a foot and bike patrol unit that used to patrol the business districts and do bike patrol in high visibility areas just to provide extra patrol and work on longer term problems that would happen in particular neighborhoods, drinking in the parks, just longer term issues that might take additional efforts. We no longer have our foot and bike units. We had a parole and probation team that used to go out and do compliance checks with people that were on parole or probation. We're no longer able to do that. We had school resource officers. The school district got rid of that contract, so we no longer have officers that are deployed to the schools. So things like that, when I say ancillary units. Those ancillary units used to also supplement patrol. So you used to see a lot more officers out in the streets because we had, the beat officers, and then we had other units out. So it appeared that we had more officers just patrolling the areas, whether they were, doing those different job duties or not. It was just extra visibility out there on the streets. So with that, we lost our ability to handle a lot of issues that I get a lot of complaints from the community about. And those are the quality of life issues that are a lot harder to measure. Those are, a lot of the traffic issues, the sideshows, the prostitution, the nuisances, whether it be homes or businesses, whether somebody's, dealing drugs out of a home, or there's drug dealing or mental health issues, specifically at a home, parking issues and abandoned vehicle issues, street sweeping, citations, mental health calls, loud music and noise calls, barking dogs, all of those complaints that we actually get more often than a lot of the violent crime. Unfortunately, we're not able to handle the bulk of those calls at this point, or it takes us a while to get there. Now we are, like I said, beefing up our patrol officer staff again. We've hired 17 officers. We're trying to get all of those officers trained so they can be solo beat officers, and we can take on a little bit more than what we've had in the last couple years. Let's see. It's also important to note our professional staff. We especially dispatchers, we are also very short-staffed in that area. We are, like patrol officers, we are hiring a lot more dispatchers. So not fully staffed, but at one point we were half-staffed in our communication center. And so we're a little bit above that, but we still have a little ways to go in our communication center also. But so far this year, we've also hired 12 professional staff this year. So our personnel and training division is doing an amazing job with our hiring efforts. We joined a campaign called 30 by 30, which is looking to hire 30% or looking to have a workforce of 30% women in law enforcement by the year 2030. So we're at about 20%, which is higher than most departments. So I'm really have an emphasis and effort on hiring women. And we're also focused on local applicants. We want to make sure that we are hiring people that are familiar with our community and, have our community's best interests in mind when they're doing this job. So I know Sohaila, as she is tonight, not Councilmember Bana, asked me about a report that recently came out called the Matrix Report. This was a report that was that the city council actually asked for, and they contracted with a group called Matrix. And basically the Matrix group took all of the data, they took various data from the police department and fire department and did a data analysis to see what the staffing needs of each of our departments is, based on the call volume and interviews with community members and other data that they took. So it was basically just strictly based on data. And their report recommended approximately 40 additional officers, addition to the 140 that I'm authorized. So bringing our numbers back up to about 180 officers and another probably approximately 20 professional staff. So I believe that report is going to be given at the next city council meeting, I think September 12th. There will be a report on the Matrix report and those recommendations. In that, they're recommending that some of the calls that the police department respond to are no longer responded to by the police department, and they have other staff available to respond to those types of calls. And they recommended the use of community service officers, which I'm looking into at this point and hoping to build a community service officer position so that some of those lower level calls, like the noise calls, the security checks or welfare checks. And when I say welfare checks, that's checking the welfare of somebody in a home, make sure that they're okay. Those can be done by civilians or professional staff as opposed to sworn staff. So they make some of those recommendations in the report in addition to the additional sworn positions that they are recommending. So I'll stop right there because that was a mouthful and give you all the opportunity to ask any questions.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. I have some questions of my own, but I'll let community members go. By the way, if you heard about this meeting via Nextdoor or Facebook, please PM me and give me your email address to be listed on my community mailing list. A recording of this meeting will be available so you can pass it around to your friends and neighbors. Carl, you have a question. Go ahead, please. Carl O'Neill, you need to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Oh, sorry about that. My question was, you mentioned, Chief, that you had 145 officers currently, is that correct?
That's my authorized number.
Oh, that's the authorized number. Okay.
Yes, I currently have 120 officers.
Okay. So the recommendation that came from the matrix report said that 145 is about what Richmond RPD needed.
No, they're saying to add an additional about 40 sworn positions to that, so about 185.
Oh, okay, okay, another 40. I was going to say that's all right. The academy, you said you had how many people in the academy currently? How many officers?
So currently I have it all right here. So I have 8 officers in the academy right now, 8 police officer trainees that are in the police academy.
How soon will they be ready to hit the streets?
So 3 of them graduate October 31st. And
Okay,
then after they graduate, it'll be at least another 6 months before they are on solo patrol. And then I
6
also
months.
have approximately, let's see, 1, 2, 3. I have about 7 officers that are currently in our training program right now. So we are hoping that 3 of them will be released to solo patrol in the next month, and then the rest within, I believe, about 4 months after that.
So
So we
then
have
we
also
haven't.
various stages of training.
Okay, so that means that we still have at least another 30 some odd officers that can still be hired. Is that correct?
We have 25 vacancies at this point. Once we meet that 145 number, then I'm sure I'll be asking City Council to move that number up to an additional numbers. Because the fact of the matter is there are a lot of things that the community wants. And when I talked about those quality of life issues, there are a lot of things that we would like to address, but we just don't have the staffing to address right now. So, you know, I focused a lot on patrol, but in our investigations, we used to have like 50 detectives in our investigations, and they do everything from domestic violence or homicide, shootings, everything within investigations. And we currently have 14 detectives in investigations. So basically, we're, of course, we're investigating homicides, but a lot of things don't get the proper investigative inquiry that we would like to give it, just because we just the caseload of cases, we just can't look at everyone in depth like we would like to.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was just going to say that I was looking at the additional 40 that was going to be added to the 145, which would be 185. So it sounds like you're still trying to meet the 145. We're trying to get it to the 185. How are we going to do that?
So, like I said, this year we've done a really good job with our recruiting efforts. We've hired 17 this year. The goal is to get up to that 145 number by the end of next year. And then we could start setting our sights hopefully higher than that. And it will all be in terms of what the actual need is. The data right now, due to crime and calls for service, is calling for the 185, and that's based on the matrix report, not based on.
Yeah.
Even though I agree. And so I think every year we should do a needs analysis to see if that 185 number is the number, or can we reduce it? We have had crime going down the last few years. It's down 5% this year compared to last year. So I think it's a constant thing that we need to evaluate. I do know that at this point, with the number of officers that we currently have, it's not enough to do the job that we are asked to do. We've had mandatory overtime for the last 2+ years where officers have to sign up for mandatory overtime just to be able to cover the beats and make sure that there are officers in each beat to respond to the calls for service.
Yeah, that's not really fair to the officers. And I can see where we really need to push for more officers as quickly as we can get them in there, because we actually have a shortage. If you think about the areas of, you live in Carriage Hills over to Hilltop Community, I was told that we'll only have 1 officer there patrolling. That's just not enough, because if we think about, there's 2 things I was going to say about Oakland and San Francisco, I hate to throw in other cities, but they're having major crime waves going on right now. Once when they beef up their police officers, then those same criminals are going to move over to Richmond. And by that time, we won't be prepared. I think we need to be prepared and start getting those officers in place now so we can be prepared for, even though the stats that you mentioned may not be there now, and that's a good thing, but at the same time, we don't want to be unprepared, because if we wait, it's going to happen, because it's happening in Oakland and San Francisco. And I'm afraid to go over there now. So I don't want to be afraid to go in my own city, Richmond, to be able to go and enjoy what's going on here in Richmond. The same way they don't want to, the people in Oakland and San Francisco are afraid to go out of their homes. And I'm speaking of a lot of people that I know.
Yeah, we don't want it to get to that point. I live here in the city too, so I want to make sure that we're being proactive,
yeah,
addressing crime issues here, and that we have the amount of staff needed to do that.
And the sideshows are coming here more so too because of that. Because again, Richmond is open right now. It's just open.
Yeah, there's a few council members that are working on ordinances, possibly for sideshows, but again, it takes staffing to enforce those ordinances.
Exactly.
So, but I'm just happy to hear that they're willing to employ some additional deterrent mechanisms so that we can address sideshows too.
All right, I thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Carl. I see some questions in the chat. If the audience here have questions that would like to share in person, of course, you would have priority. If there are no questions, I'm going to ask my questions quickly before I share the chat's question. And that's about the cameras. When are they going to be deployed, and how many, and where in the city?
So we received council approval for the first round of flock cameras. I think it was 30-something cameras, which was not nearly enough to cover our city. I think San Pablo, which we completely surround, has 100 cameras themselves. So we deployed the first 30 cameras in various areas. We do not give out the exact locations because we don't want people to avoid them. But we are deploying them throughout the city. So every neighborhood will have, some level of either LPR, which is the license plate reader cameras, or pan tilt zoom. So after the 30, which are license plate reader cameras, were deployed, then city council approved additional cameras. So we're getting an additional, I believe it's 70 license plate reader cameras and another 30 or 40 pan tilt zoom cameras. So we are deploying them based on crime also. So the first 30, we looked at where high crime issues were happening, and those were the priority locations. We also want to spread the wealth to make sure that we are covering the city. So the next 70 that we're deploying, we're looking at where in each neighborhood or each district would it best serve us. So every neighborhood should have some level of cameras.
Thank you. My last question before I go to the chat questions. One of the major concerns for people in the very high fire hazard severity zone is evacuation. And also we live on Hayward Fault. Has the assessment, the matrix report, looked into the fact that Richmond has around 120,000 people, and in case of a major earthquake, is the police force enough for that, or how many evacuation takes, and what's your own personal opinion about that? How ready are we for that?
So the matrix report did not specifically address wildfire issues or evacuations or anything like that. They just looked at specific data, calls for service, data, workload. The police department has over the years had to evacuate different neighborhoods. So we are prepared for that. We're ready for that. Up in the hills, especially Carriage Hills and Amend area, it's a little bit more difficult because in some areas there's only two ways in and out. So it would all depend on where the wildfire is in terms of, you know, which direction we'd be evacuating. But I think Mr. Carl earlier identified the fact that there's only one officer between Carriage Hills and all the way over to Hilltop Green, or close to Hilltop. And there's only one officer from Hilltop all the way to Parkchester and down, you know, back into the flatlands. And so two officers in that very large area is not a lot. And so we would have to call for officers in other areas to come up and help us. But we've always gotten it done. I'm very confident in our officers that they will know what to do, that they'll be able to respond and handle any evacuations. I think that we should also continue to look at different services. We're getting our Nixle service back up and running so that we can notify residents promptly. I mean, we've learned a lot of lessons from the Maui fire, so we're continuing to talk about, you know, what those incidents that happen outside of our area are good talking points and conversation for us to have. If that happened there, I mean, if it happened here, what happened there, what would we do? And so we're always constantly communicating about those efforts.
Thank you. So to the chat questions, first question is about reorganization chart. Are there any plans for reorganization?
So we reorganize our department every single year for the last at least 3 years, and that's due to the reduced staffing. So we're constantly evaluating and looking at how we can best deploy the staff that we do have. And so we're constantly reevaluating and, you know, moving our organization chart around to accommodate the staffing that we have.
Thank you. Next question says, Matrix recommends RPD staffing at 255. It looks like we are desperately short of detectives, 12 versus recommended total of 42.
Yes, we are very short staffed in our investigations unit, and patrol comes first. Our patrol deployment, being able to respond to 911 calls, and because when people call 911, they need a response. And so our primary focus all the time is being able to respond to those calls for service. There's 9 beats across the entire city. That's not a lot. 9 officers to cover the entire city. And so we have to have all of those 9 beats filled just to be able to respond to calls. Over the weekend, we had a homicide, and I could tell you that at least 6 of those officers were tied up dealing with that homicide, which meant that a large section of our city was uncovered for hours while we investigate the homicide, until we could get homicide investigators to come in, we could secure the scene. We had another event last Friday night that took nearly the entire 9 officers to deal with crowd control and a hostage, or not a hostage situation, but a barricaded subject in a home. And so it took a significant amount of resources to that particular area. So when I say 9 officers, it might seem like a lot, but not for a city this size with the amount of incidents that we have.
Thank you. The next question is about code enforcement. Since regulatory moved to code enforcement, have they asked RPD for assistance? Has anyone been hired to do enforcement?
So regulatory did not actually move to code enforcement. A couple of the duties actually moved to code enforcement, but not the whole regulatory unit. And unfortunately, there's just a lot that the regulatory unit that used to handle that are it's just no longer being handled. When I talked about the compliance checks with the liquor stores and the marijuana grows,
What's the matter, honey?
a lot of those things just aren't being handled anymore. So the code enforcement is handling like licensing and stuff for marijuana dispensaries, but there's just a lot that the regulatory unit that used to do that right now we have no capacity to handle.
Thank you. The next question is a bit too long and explains that Matrix recommends 255, including 12 new positions, 8 community service officers for non-emergency routine calls to mental health field clinicians. And Matrix also recommends examining opportunities to utilize the mental health team regionally with other nearby municipalities. Is Richmond considering following Matrix's recommendation to cooperate regionally rather than creating its own mental health response team? Contra Costa County has the A3 Mobile Crisis Response Team supported by Measure X funds. And this would conserve Richmond taxpayer money to be used elsewhere because we all know Richmond has many needs.
So that is not a police department question. That is going to be a city council direction question. So I do want to start off by saying that the police department is in complete support of alternative response units to respond to mental health calls and unhoused calls and lower level, not necessarily crime calls. We are completely supportive of that. It will be up to city council, though, to decide whether they're going to use the A3 model of the county or if there's going to be a separate unit that's developed either in the city or with another nonprofit or organization to respond to the mental health calls, which is a recommendation, I think, of the Reimagine Richmond.
Thank you. I just wanted to add to this that I was at a presentation by Anna Roth, the head of the county health department, and she mentioned that they also got approved to charge Medi-Cal for their services. So they get nearly $20 million from Measure X, I guess, and then they have Medi-Cal. I think that'd be hard to compete with. Last question from this resident is, I would like to hear your suggestions, recommendations on how to deal with sideshows.
Sideshows. So sideshows have been an issue for many years. They just weren't that big of an issue here in Richmond until the last few years. But Oakland's been having this issue for 25 plus years. So the issue with sideshows, when I mentioned earlier that a couple of council members are looking at ordinances that we can have here in Richmond that can serve as deterrents. So if there's already laws that we use when we do encounter sideshows, when we can catch somebody in the act and we have the amount of staffing available. It's just, you know, I said we have 9 officers and then we get surged with 50 to 100 to 150 cars. And how many of those can we actually get? We have 9 officers. If somebody's in sideshow activity, it's going to at least take 2 of those officers, maybe even 3 to deal with that one particular car. And so, I mean, we've just pretty much tried to corral them and get them out of our city when we come. If we are lucky and we're able to stop one and tow a car, we do tow the car for 30 days, which is a significant impact financially for that person, and, you know, issue citations and stuff like that. I'm in support of the ordinances because if there's additional fines that the city can levy against people involved in sideshow activity, that can serve as a deterrent. Maybe they'll go to another city that doesn't have an ordinance and extra fees that they would have to pay. But it all comes down to also being able to have the staffing to go out and actually deal with it and actually impact some people so that the word can get out that Richmond's not the place to come to for sideshows. And when I talk about those ancillary units and having an actual traffic unit, those are the units that can, you know, come in on a Friday night or a Saturday night and do those types of operations. And like I said, right now, we just don't have the capacity to do a lot of that because officers are already working mandatory overtime just to answer calls for service, and to force them to come in for operations like this is just not fair right now.
Thank you. Our next couple of questions are from Marianne, who's asking, what is the mood among the current officers?
So I could tell you in 2019, 2020, 2021, when we went through the defunding effort, morale was at the lowest I've seen in my 25-year career. We are finally, I think, moving in the right direction in the police department where we're hiring. I am focused on a lot of organizational wellness efforts. So because, you know, working, you know, overtime and being here a lot of the time, I want officers to feel comfortable. I want them to feel supported. I want them to feel mentally well. And so I'm focused on a lot of wellness efforts around the department. So I think morale is finally going up. We've done a lot in the last year. We have an app where officers can, where it's gauging, officers providing them with resources if they're feeling a certain way, ask questions of them. How are you feeling today? What's the mood like? And then offering some suggestions and literature. We increased our gym and provided time for officers to work out if time permits. We went into contract with a organization called PSG, which provides psychological services for officers, which, when officers were struggling before, we referred to them to EAP through the city. And that was a challenge for us because EAP was first of all, it was hard to find a clinician. And then it was hard to find a clinician that had any background or any knowledge of law enforcement, which is unique. And so PSG basically is a group of therapists that are law enforcement specific. So officers can contact those therapists at any time. They get a certain number of sessions per year. Those are all new things this year. Just a lot of organizational wellness efforts, because I know that what we've put our officers through in the last few years, and just dealing with the fact that, a lot of us came into this profession to serve, and, law enforcement and police officers were considered heroes, and it's no longer like that. There's a lot of negative sentiment around police officers, and, just dealing with the negativity is difficult. And so I want them to be able to have a release so that they're healthy physically, mentally, and they can go out and do the job that they're expected to do without, that heavy weight on their shoulders.
Thank you. The next question is, how can we support our RPD during this extreme shortage? At one time, we had community policing. What is the status of that now and future expectations?
So we'll never get away from community policing. We have to have community policing. The police department, especially now with the short staff, cannot do this job by itself. We depend on the community to call us, to provide information, to work with us towards common goals. And so I know that when we went through the reimagining Richmond, and the city council actually created the task force to reimagine Richmond, the wording said to move away from the current community policing model. Well, I was completely against that part of it, because community policing is what I believe what has led us to the lower crime rates here in Richmond, and the trust that has been built between the community and the police department, and how we've been successful in reducing our crime rates and just really partnering with our community. So we're just trying to figure out how we do that with the amount of staff we have. We still have some community events that we're trying to do. We were just out on Sunday at the Soulful Softball Sunday, being able to provide services that the police department normally provides here out in the community, because we know that not everybody wants to come to the police department. So we're still looking for different opportunities to connect with the community.
Thank you. Before we go to the next question, which is very important about street sweeping, now that we're talking about the police department and community and everything, I would like to ask you to please talk about the cultural sensitivity training that you're planning or improving for the police department. I personally am very excited about it. It's wonderful to have a female police chief. No offense to male police chiefs, but and then at some point, if there is time, I would like to ask you to explain how you help with violence against women and domestic violence, because that's a passion of mine as a human rights defender. And you're working 30 by 30. That's awesome. So thank you for all that. But if you could talk about your efforts to internally improve the culture within the police department, which I believe is great, I would appreciate that, because I think the community deserves to know. It's not the same police department. It's just evolving continuously.
Sure. So I talked about, 2020 and 2021 being difficult years for us because our staffing reduced, and a lot of it was the defunding and the what happened with George Floyd, and just even before that, there's just been ongoing incidents across the nation where law enforcement has lost the trust of the community based on incidents that have happened between law enforcement and the community, and negative incidents where unfortunately people have lost their lives at the hand of law enforcement. And so while you know, a lot of times when we look at, you know, what happened during that time for personnel and law enforcement, it's like we lost a lot of funding, we lost this, we lost that, but we also gained a lot. We gained a lot of knowledge in terms of things that we needed to do to change our profession for the better so that we can reduce the life loss of community members and how we engage. And one of the things that came out of it for our department is cultural competency training. So we started a training module where we're talking about cultural competency, but this year I'm actually enhancing that, where I'm talking about specific things that have happened here in the city of Richmond that has led to trust being broken between the community and the police department. I want all of our new officers coming in and those that are working here, we have a very young workforce, to understand those incidents, because even though, you know, they might have happened before any of us worked here, they still have an impact on how the community feels about the police department. So I had this summer, we had an intern doing a lot of research on some of those incidents, and I'll specifically name a couple. So for instance, if you've been here a long time, you might have heard of the Cowboys, the Richmond Cowboys, which were supposedly a group of Richmond police officers that basically tormented people, Black people within the community. And there was a 60 Minutes piece. It led to the largest settlement in civil rights settlement in the nation's history at that point back in the 80s. And when I came here to work, I used to hear references to the Richmond Cowboys from community members. Oh, he's a cowboy. He, you know, beat up my dad, or whoever, whatever it might be. But there were negative connotations about the Cowboys. I actually, when I started working here, worked with some of these officers that were labeled as cowboys. And so I didn't know anything of the Cowboys before I came to work here. So I started to doing research and learned about that history. Finally got to saw the 60 Minutes piece because it's not online, but was able to I was able to track down a copy of that video, and we're going to be showing it to our officers so that they know the history, so they know when people are yelling at them in the community and making reference to the Cowboys, what they actually mean, and how that was a negative time in history between the police and the community, and how that's affecting relationships even up to this date. Another incident was the death of PD Perez that happened back in 2015, I believe, and how, you know, the Perez family comes to city council meetings, and how that just incident has again tarnished the relationship between the police department and the community. I think officers should know that. We should also be looking to figure out how we can prevent that from happening again. So we're trying to make sure that we don't repeat history, and that all those points in which we've lost trust within the community, officers are aware of that, and they can respond appropriately to community members that are still upset about that. And we can just talk about lessons learned. So that's one of the things that we're working on, finalizing that personalizing that cultural competency piece for our future training.
Thank you very much. So the next question is about street sweeping, and will enforcement of parking on street sweeping days be returning at some point? I hope so.
Yes, it will be. I'm working with the Public Works Director, Daniel Chavaria. He's fairly new. He's been here for a few months, but he's been super busy since he's been here. Great to work with though. And so we've been working together to figure out how we can get street sweeping going again. Some of it is council direction. We'll be actually going to the city council and asking for direction in terms of how they want the street sweeping to be re-implemented. They gave direction back in, I believe, the end of 2021, but some of the direction that they gave was based on different things that could not be implemented. So we're asking for additional direction. And then one of the things that has been talked about in city council about street sweeping is the entire city does not have signage for street sweeping. The police department can only enforce where there is signage. And there is controversy amongst communities on that signage. So some communities do not want signage in their neighborhood. They don't want the sign to be put up. And then the communities that do have signs say it's not fair that they get ticketed and the other neighborhoods don't. So there's a lot that may need to happen. We'll be coming back to city council to get direction for that. In terms of the police department, how we're preparing for that, the city council authorized additional 2 parking enforcement officers. So we had 5 parking enforcement officers, and that staffing was reduced to 3 at some point. And then they just recently allocated an additional 2, so we're back up to 5, but we still have 2 vacant positions. We're trying to hire those positions. Once we have the 5, and once we get the additional questions answered from city council as to how we're going to enforce which neighborhoods, if we're going to do the entire city, how long it will take for those signs to be put up across the entire city, we'll be coming back to council, because the 5 officers that we have is not enough to cover the entire city for street sweeping. So there's always a domino effect. The neighborhoods that we had before that do have signs, the 5 parking enforcements that we had before that did the enforcement couldn't even cover the neighborhoods that had the signs. So we would definitely need more parking enforcement officers to cover the entire city. And it's an equality issue. People want to make sure that certain neighborhoods aren't targeted and others aren't.
Thank you very much.
The bottom line is, hopefully soon, by the end of the year, we'll have some type of parking enforcement program for street sweeping. However, if we do have to do signs for every neighborhood before it's enforced, it will take a lot longer than that, probably till mid next year.
Excellent. Thank you. If there are no questions from the audience, I have one more question, and we're getting to the end of the time. I think we have time for questions. If you have any, please feel free to share your questions or concerns or suggestions. Otherwise, I was pleasantly surprised actually when I visited the Family Justice Center to learn that our police chief, Bisa French, was involved with it. With establishing it, with the ongoing process, helping victims of domestic violence. And I would like to invite everyone to a grand event at our Civic Center Plaza on Saturday, September 30th for the Latina Center. The theme is ending violence against women. Our police chief will be there. And I would like to ask, maybe not.
I'm actually out of town.
Okay. I would like to ask you to please talk about either your own experience or what the police department does, because many people, before I was a city council member, I had no idea. I thought it was only nonprofits working on it. So it's nice to know the role of the police department, or detectives in human trafficking, domestic violence, everything. Please.
Sure. So the police department actually had a huge role in developing the Family Justice Center. Back when I was a sergeant in our domestic and sexual violence unit, attended the very first meeting to start a Family Justice Center. I had no idea what it was. And this was back in, I believe, 2009. And I worked very hard with the county and Stand for Families Free of Violence and Community Violence Solutions. I think we were the core group that pretty much worked together to establish the first Family Justice Center here in Contra Costa County. We've since expanded, so our Family Justice Center here in Contra Costa County started here in Richmond, expanded to Concord. Now they're in East County, and then we're even partnering with Solano County. But basically, it's a center where people can go to the victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, elder abuse, child abuse, and human trafficking. Can go to one spot to receive services. So we identified the need because unfortunately we're here in West County and a lot of services are in Central or East County. And we identified the need to have services here so that if somebody wanted to get out of the situation, out of domestic violence situation, then they didn't have to go all over the county to receive the resources or talk to the people that could help them. So I was on the very first planning. I did all the planning through opening our first center, which we actually donated our Hilltop substation, where we had a temporary location. We got a bond measure. The county gave us the building that we're currently at on 24th Street. We got a bond to rehab that building, went through everything from picking out carpet and designing the center. So it's kind of like my baby. But I've since had to, I was on the board for the Family Justice Center until recently, because other people need to be able to take over. But we've done a lot of things there, and we've implemented a lot of programs here in the city of Richmond based on our relationships with our Family Justice Center. We have a lethality assessment where officers, when they're on a domestic violence call, they ask a series of questions to assess the lethality of the situation, and they connect victims with an advocate right there on scene. There's a lot, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but yeah, that's our Family Justice Center.
Thank you.
Our domestic and sexual violence unit is actually also housed at the Family Justice Center. So that's a unit that is not here in the police department. That unit is actually their desk space and everything is in the Family Justice Center, so that they have access to victims. The victims have access to them more easily.
Excellent. I would like to add that Michelle Milam of the police department has been helping me in collaboration with the Family Justice Center to bring in a resolution to the city council for improving the status of women in the city and actually working towards ending violence against women. And I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for everything you're doing for the city, for changing the culture from within the department, for serving residents and everything. We wish you the best of luck, and you have the community's full support, as you see. And if there are no more questions, it's the first time I think that we are finishing a few minutes actually before the end of time. Would you like to add anything at the end for the community?
It's been a pleasure. I appreciate you all having me, and I look forward to working with you all.
And we thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Chief French. We'll stay in touch. Have a nice evening, everyone. Bye.
You too. Bye-bye.
Great.